Welcome to the Health Catalyst podcast, brought to you by YPO. Here we talk about the business of health innovation, and I sit down with industry leaders who have been in the trenches. My goal is to share the lessons and provide practical and actionable advice to help you launch, grow, and scale your business. I am your host, Rodrigo Hute. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today, my guest is Arun Gupta. Arun is a successful health tech entrepreneur, and today we'll be discussing mental health innovation. Arun, he's the executive chairman of the board of Peak Health, a digital therapeutics company in the mental health space, and he's also the founder of Quartet Health. This is a tech and clinical services company, also in the mental health space. Arun, thank you so much for being here today and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Appreciate the flattering introduction and excited to just dive in and have a full conversation.
I'm very excited about this topic. So let's jump right in because I have a lot of questions today. Let's start with the story. I want to know what's behind the story, behind Big Health, and and also what inspired you to focus on mental health as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, absolutely. So all credit to our founders. I've generally been a founder, an investor, or sort of board member, advisor in companies. Big Health was not a company that I founded, actually. We have two great founders, Peter Hames and Colin Espy. And I had joined the board, and then over time they asked me to step in and run the company and serve as executive chairman. That's how I ended up getting involved. And their origin story starts about 10 years ago with the basic, simple premise and experience of an insomnia sufferer trying to figure out how to get care and realizing that the medications that are predominantly prescribed weren't working particularly well for lots of people. And there's actually very evidence-based forms of therapy for insomnia sufferers that unfortunately people just don't get and are very hard to get. And Colin Espy, who's a leading sleep medicine psychologist globally, had written a book about it. And Peter found that book and he self-trained through using Colin's book, and then eventually reached out to Colin and said, hey, we should create a company around this and we should put this into an app and allow people to have access to essentially a self-paced therapeutic experience such that they can, get better. And that was how the company started. And they're both out of the UK, and the company started in the UK and had a lot of traction in the early days doing essentially research studies with the NHS, and then eventually came to the US around the employers. And we figured out a commercial model with large employers and health plans reimbursing access to the product for their membership. And then now is somewhat global, both with UK and US scale reimbursement plans.
Interesting. Very, very good. So the company Big Health has a number of products. To my understanding, you have two flagship products. One is for sleep, which is the one that you just mentioned. I think it's called Sleep.io. And the second one, it's for anxiety. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
That's correct. So Sleep.io was our flagship first program. We eventually got it fully through lots of trials and cleared by the FDA. And so Sleep.io RX is a treatment for insomnia. And then we later built Daylight, which is in the generalized anxiety disorder space. And we also put that through trials and got that cleared this summer. And so both of those products are FDA cleared, prescription grade products. And then we have a third product actually in the depression space called Spark that is coming up developmentally behind the other two.
All right. Very interesting. And who's your target audience? I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, it's the patient who's going to be using the digital therapeutic. But do you sell directly to consumers, or do you have to go through employers or health systems, or how does it work for you guys?
I mean, I think in healthcare, that's always a complicated question, right? Because there's buyers and there's users, and oftentimes those are different parties. So like I'll start with, at the end of the day, the patient, because that's ultimately, in my mind, what's most important, and it's why I got into this space in the first place, which is that there's a lot of people suffering with mental health conditions that are actually rather treatable based on science and treatment programs that we already have discovered as a society and understand today. And the medical system has just been very bad at getting that to patients, which is unlike most of the rest of the medical system. Generally, when we discover new forms of treatment, it takes some time, but they do find their way eventually into everyday medical care. So we can come back and talk about that. But our patients are generally suffering from one of those conditions or multiple conditions, and they're desiring of help and a better state. And so they're clinical users. I don't think of this as like, the fitness apps, or like if you track your sleep, like a lot of us track our sleep and we're constantly trying to, that's a use case. That's frankly more of a consumer use case. These are people who have, on standardized scales of assessment, real disordered sleep. In the insomnia case, they're having significant bouts of interrupted sleep in a given night. They're not close to accomplishing a full night's sleep on a regular basis. They're typically having real life impairment attached to that. They're sleepy at work. They're losing their job. They're having trouble functioning. Like there's sort of real things happening in their life as a product of these conditions. And we're able to deliver an at-scale clinical grade treatment. The payers, just to close the first part of your question, in the U.S., it's been large employers and to some degree health plans. And then we're hopeful that there's been a couple of breakthroughs this summer that will lead to reimbursement at large in the U.S. healthcare system for clinical grade digital mental health treatment. And in the UK, we typically work directly with the nationalized health system on an at-scale population-wide type procurement to make the product available to all residents.
Okay, so my understanding is that if, you need to have a clinic, it has to be clinically documented by a doctor. You need to get a prescription in order to get it. You cannot use any of these apps or digital therapeutics as a consumer. So if I have some insomnia, or if I have general anxiety, is it an app? Is it an app that I could potentially download and use myself, or does it have to be prescribed by a physician, or I would have to be working at one of these large employers or be part of a health system that currently prescribes this?
You're understanding it correctly. Like we don't have like a pay X dollars per month and you can just download the app and start using it. It's usually delivered inside of a treatment paradigm.
Okay.
And then it's reimbursed as a product of that. It's typically no cost or low cost, either zero cost or low cost to the individual patient.
I see. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. Let's talk a little bit about the current state of mental health, and in particular, mental health treatment, has historically leaned heavily on therapy, therapy by a provider, by a doctor, and also using medications or pharmaceuticals. It's A or B or the combination of both. How do you see digital therapeutics shifting this balance? And what's happening right now with this new tool that now physicians have within their toolkit, and what has been the response so far from the medical community, primarily? That, in my experience, the medical community, they are not the fastest adopters of new technologies. In my experience, it takes time for the medical community to adopt and deploy new tools, because they want to see evidence and lots of research. So just to summarize the long question, is like how has digital therapeutics shifting this balance between how it's currently treated today?
Well, let me touch on the first part, and then let me come around to the providers. The treatment paradigm is, as you said, which is that in the U.S., the vast majority of people with a mental health condition receive no care. So they don't even get treatment. Either they don't know that they have a condition, they don't surface in the medical system for that condition, they surface for that condition and someone tells them to do something and they don't really want to do that thing, or they don't do that thing. And so the state of affairs, and the US is the most resourced mental health delivery system in the world. And we have shortages. So, you and I both hail from countries outside of the US. We have to have a global perspective on this issue. These are high prevalence conditions. Generally, they're not esoteric, very targeted, rare conditions. And generally, medical systems around the world are treating well less than half of the individuals that need care. The predominant treatment form in the developed world is prescription medications, the Ambiens in the insomnia area, Xanax, the SSRIs and antidepressants in the anxiety and depression case. And the minority actually get to therapy, right? Because it's hard, it's expensive, they don't want to go to therapy. There's a lot of reasons why that's hard. So that is in my mind as an entrepreneur, a grossly unacceptable state of affairs for a clinical set of conditions. Like, I can't think of another area of the medical system that performs so poorly in getting people access to evidence-based care. And again, I'm not saying that as a judgment on any, it's just that's the state that we've ended up in. And on the positive side, there's just a tremendous amount of destigmatization and interest and demand and awareness in the individual patient around these conditions and these opportunities to get better. So we need a third treatment paradigm. I'm optimistic that digital therapeutics broadly can be that third paradigm, because we probably need to treat, like in the US alone, we probably need to treat about 10 times as many people in a given year as we treat in the mental health world. If you put that on a global scale, we probably need to treat about 100 times as many people in a given year as we treat. And so digital is probably the only way to scale in that way, in that you can cost effectively at a more modest price point deliver evidence-based care in the comfort of the individual's schedule and phone and whatnot. So I think we desperately need a third paradigm. I think that could be digital therapeutics. It might be some other things. And so that's your first point. And the second point is, we've spent, the better part of 10 years doing tremendous amounts of research on these products. We've now had, I think, 90 or so peer-reviewed papers. We've had our products studied in over 15 randomized control trials. We've done pivotal trials in conjunction with the FDA. We've published all of our research. And I think that's just central to that whole point about like the system adopting something. There's no shortcut for that. That is unfortunately like a multi-year process typically. And I think it's something that this company has always taken very seriously and been very committed to. And it's why I think, again, coupled with the current state of affairs not being so great, if there were magical medicines or treatment was working so well in these arena, it might be hard to come in as an innovator. But in our case, there's a widespread recognition from providers and patients that we're not handling this stuff so well, and we need something that's different. And then when you show up with the robust clinical evidence and clinical grade programming that we put together, the adoption on the provider and patient level has not been the part that's been challenging.
Would you say that the fact that Big Health has been publishing 90 papers, as you get peer-reviewed publications, is that correlated with the growth that Big Health has been seeing over the last few years? Would you say that because of doing research and getting peer-reviewed publications, you are getting faster and faster adoption amongst the medical community, or is not necessarily correlated?
Definitely. I mean, it's lagged, of course, right? Like you do the research now, you take the time to run the trial, you then take time to do the analysis and submit it and get it published. So that's an elongated process, but 100%. Like the quality of our products, their clinical efficacy and the evidentiary base behind them is the number one reason why whatever success we have as a company we have is because of that.
But why 90 papers? Like if you're an entrepreneur and you're launching a new digital therapeutics company, I mean, don't you need only one paper to convince doctors that doctors and the FDA? Like why? What's the rationale behind having so many papers?
I mean, you're probably right. Like it's probably not one, but it's probably not 90. We didn't probably have to do, a high teens number of RCTs, but we have an amazing research team. We have amazing collaborations with a lot of the leading researchers all around the globe that are interested in these topics. Mm-hmm. And we've been very open to making the products available in research settings. And that's continued to prove new and interesting things around the uses of these products that has been additive to everything we've been doing. So
I see. I get it. So it's not only you guys as a company like running these RCTs, but it's also other researchers and scientists who are interested in your technology that they are running their own RCTs.
Correct. And then we're looking at very different patient populations. We'll look at the postpartum population, or we'll look at oncology and cancer, and the interplay of insomnia to some of those conditions. And so there's a lot of, I think each time we've done research studies and written these papers, it's been an additive element of knowledge around how these products can be used in the world, which is ultimately, what's created the space. I think also I've been an innovator and an entrepreneur, my whole life. And I've found that when you're creating a new market, it's very different than competing in an existing market. And we definitely are in the creating a market, kind of category of company. And that just means you have to be that much better. You have to be that much more open. You have to be that much more scrutinous about your efficacy, the research. You need to be more willing to collaborate. You need to be more willing to publish. You need to be more willing to talk because you're trying to bring people to an idea that they might not know to be possible or be inclined to think is the right answer, out of the gates. And so I think we've taken that responsibility to heart in this company, from the get-go. And again, to give the founders a lot of credit. I think they were on that really from the very beginning.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Like 10 years ago, I started a digital health company, and the company was creating a new category, a new market, and it's a completely different game and battle, versus competing in an existing sector. So this company called Pear Therapeutics, I think they did a good job for a while. They existed for about 10 years before they decided to close the company. How has the Pear Therapeutics experience impacted Big Health positively or negatively? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I know the entrepreneur, reasonably well. I think he's awesome. I think they had a lot of amazing people. I think they were pioneers. There's a lot of differences in the way their products work. Their products were in the opioid use disorder space predominantly, and they were typically delivered in conjunction with medication-assisted therapy, ideally, which is the standard of care in that space. And so that was a very Medicaid, heavy space in terms of where the clinical use was. So there's a lot of nuances to like where our respective products, how they worked and where they played, and what the experiences were like and the quality of those experiences at the consumer level. But I think the similarity is that they, like us, have been working, particularly in the US, to build some sort of at-scale reimbursement paradigm for these products. We can't just fit them into the drug pricing thing as if they were like a new molecule. Like I've often said, if you just took all of our evidence and you could just formulate it into a pill, this business would have, had multi-billion revenue already, but there's no reimbursement paradigm to date in the healthcare system. And so I think we and they and a couple of other companies have been working very hard and advocating with all the reimbursement bodies to create a paradigm. And I think they were trailblazers in that process, and it just took longer and they ran out of capital before that could come together. So there's a healthy amount of sharing, and again, I have a lot of respect for the entrepreneur and talk about making a market. I mean, they were trailblazers, and we've collaborated with them on a lot of stuff, and we benefit from all being in this together, trying to again create scale reimbursement pathways, and then eventually, the doctor referral pathway. You would like doctors nationwide to say, "Oh, Rodrigo, you're struggling with your sleep. Let me get you on Sleep RX. It's this great program that but that takes a lot of time, and they have to get educated that these digital therapeutics are available. And we've sort of all been on this journey together as companies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of the community. When you're creating a new market, all of different players in the same space are opening the different doors, and it benefits the ones that are coming behind as well. So it's part of the game. Let me ask you already mentioned that two of your leading products, Sleep.io RX and also Daylight, are amongst the first digital therapeutics to receive FDA clearance. And I wanted to ask you if you could walk us through the journey of getting these products FDA cleared, and what were some of the key steps and challenges along the way? What are some learnings, some insights or tips that you could give others who are trying to do something similar and get FDA approval?
I mean, it's a reasonable undertaking. It's not for the faint of heart. I really am grateful to our team members. We have some amazing team members that really spearheaded that work. I think in our case, because we had such a strong base of evidence, building the trials to submit with FDA was less risky than can sometimes be the case. Sometimes you're going into a trial and you don't really know where the results are going to come out. We had run trials quite similar to the trials that we ran in our pivotal setting. So we had, more knowledge maybe, and we were in market already with employers. We had a lot of valuable insight that you don't typically have going into an experience like that. And I'd say that the agency, to their credit, again, I didn't know a lot about how these things work as an entrepreneur, more broadly from the software world. But I would say that I was really impressed at how engaged and open the federal government agencies are around a two-way discussion to set the trials up correctly and how these things would be evaluated, and what are the right, and these are all documented and open communication. But I think I had a naive perspective. Again, it's like more of a software entrepreneur that you sort of send your your manila folder in to the government Dropbox, and then 3 months later you get an official letter in the mail. And I think that they're very well-intended people, and they're trying to do the right thing, and they obviously have safety, the safety of the population in mind as their primary mission. So that was part of it. And then I think the other part of it that I didn't understand and appreciate as much is that these digital therapeutics are generally regulated in the medical device pathway. And medical devices traditionally, are hardware devices predominantly that oftentimes were implantable. Think about defibrillators, think about insulin pumps. And so the safety management on them is remarkably important, appropriately so, because they're going to end up in human beings for potentially many, many year periods. And so the way they get built requires a quality management system to be in place, a lot of documentation. Each release and update needs to be resubmitted oftentimes to the agency. And so our products look like software products on a phone, but what people don't realize is there's a very large quality management endeavor behind it to document and continually submit, particularly in a software context where, we might want to update that program, certainly every, couple days, couple weeks, and we might batch that into a couple months of an update to the agency. Whereas a hardware device might get updated generationally every 2 or 3 or 4 years. So I think that's just, again, being a market innovator, we've had to engage with the agency around, here's how a software product is going to work. We're in the medical device pathway, and so we're going to do everything that you said we need to do to be regulated as a medical device. let's talk about how these products are actually going to get updated in the wild. That's different than like a more traditional hardware device, which is good for patients. Then how can we build a system whereby that is managed to the objectives of safety and of the agency?
Did you guys hire the specialized consultants to help you with the FDA process, or did you do everything in-house with your internal teams?
We have people on the team mostly that have done that. We hired a CRO for some of the trials, but the people on our team are specialists. Like they are remarkably skilled at this, and they've spent their whole careers, working on these sorts of things for different companies over the years. And so we benefited tremendously from the education and the leveling up that some of those people, brought to the company.
Okay, cool. Very interesting. How long does it take normally? I know that it really depends on the product and and many other factors, but how long did it take you on average to get FDA approval?
I mean, it's a multi-year process. If you really go back to like when we first started thinking about it, I think the actual running the pivotal trial, collecting the results, analyzing that, submitting to the agency, back and forth, and that process narrowly defined might have been, a year or so, give or take, maybe a year and a half. We started thinking about this probably 3 years ago and started laying some of the track maybe 4 years ago. So it's a multi-year process. I mean, I think as an entrepreneur, we were very committed to being a healthcare treatment. We think of these as healthcare treatments, and that is more of a healthcare business model in the medical system, reimbursed. It's kind of not a consumer like, hey, download my app and $9.99 a month. And there's a lot of things that come with going down that go-to-market. I think as an entrepreneur, one of the biggest things that we all have is the responsibility to be decisive, particularly around long-term strategy. And I think we've had a clear view, the leadership of this company, that, the critical thing that we're doing in the world is scaling treatment grade care. And so then we need to back up the business model and the go-to-market against that, which had a lot of implications for how we built the company.
Yeah, absolutely. You also need to have the right investors on board. I mean, you either have to be profitable to be able to invest for the long term and have the resources to, invest in those clinical trials and these multi-year projects to get FDA approval, or you need to have the right investors. The investors that know that these things can take time, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're blessed. We have a great board. We have great investors. I think everyone has seen the long-term potential that we should be treating millions, maybe tens of millions of people a year. We can scale a new reimbursement pathway and a new treatment. And there's a huge mission, most importantly, that comes out of that. But there's undoubtedly a huge company that gets built in that process. And the group has been sufficiently long-term in its thinking. I think obviously we manage everything on a weekly basis, and we have a lot of board calls, and there's a lot of interaction along the way. But I think one of the biggest responsibilities is leaders in a company, or shareholders, as board members, is to remind ourselves that, particularly in the venture world, we're in these things for what they are going to be 3, 5, 7, 8 years from now, not what they are today. And so how do we hold both of those truths at the same time as we're making decisions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Let me ask you a question about revenue growth and go-to-market strategy. What advice would you give on how to drive, revenue, customer acquisition, customer growth, in the digital therapeutic space, and we're talking about prescription-based digital therapeutics. Like, what works, what hasn't worked, what tips would you give someone who is building a digital therapeutics company and they're trying to get new customers and drive revenue?
I mean, I'll answer that, but then I'll zoom out a little bit. I would say real prescription grade, clinical grade digital therapeutic needs to go through traditional treatment-like pathways in the medical system, which is typically reimbursement, which is typically doctor, or therapist, provider provisioning. And typically that means you have to figure out reimbursement pathways, with insurance bodies or the government. and you have a more like B2B kind of B2B2C sort of type business model. Mm-hmm. I think more broadly though in healthcare, we're going through so much of the digestion of the last many years of innovation in the digital health arena. And I think everyone wants to find some magic business model that works way better than the others. And I just think that they're all viable and it's all about great entrepreneurs doing amazing work, and none are, there's direct consumer companies that people have sort of fallen out of love with, but are working really, really well when you get underneath the cover of it, because people want stuff and they get to the internet. And if these companies have great brands and content and they're able to deliver magic, that works. That can be a business model. There's people that go to the health insurance companies and do health plan deals. People go to the employers, do employer deals. There's people that go to the big pharma companies and do deals with them and build software and delivery models against that. So healthcare is a big industry, and I don't know that any one of those is wildly right to the point of excluding or precluding those others. But they take remarkable execution, which is always the critical thing at the end of the day, behind any of these entrepreneurial successes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. What has been one of the biggest challenges to commercialize these products? I mean, is it more about getting the reimbursements, and is it more like convincing the physicians or convincing the administrators at some of these health systems?
I think the industry would broadly say reimbursement, because again, patients, they're not enjoying having these conditions. They want a better pathway. Some of them are adverse to the medications, but they're unwilling to go to therapy, or they don't have access to therapy because it's too cumbersome, or they can't take an hour in the middle of the day. Working population, they're on their feet all day. They can't get on a Zoom like you and I are right now and kind of have their little, weekly Zoom therapy. It's not a model that works for a lot of people in our society. So, and I think providers similarly too. So I don't find that that's really where the gap is. I think it's that we're doing something new in healthcare, and I don't think there's opposition to reimbursement per se. But I think when you're doing something that's new in healthcare, there is a reasonably slow cycle of adoption and staying with it to kind of figure out these reimbursement pathways, to get codes in place, to get medical policies to change. And that's just, I don't want to say that's been like the challenge or hard, because I think it's a very surmountable issue, but I think it takes time. And most entrepreneurs and venture-backed companies are very impatient. We have these very near-term, targets to hit goals or exit or whatever it may be. And I think that's more where there's been a disconnect, because then you're spending and you're burning a lot of capital, to race through some process. But some of these health plans might only update their policy in this arena once a year, for example. This is not an arena that may be in focus, so they kind of leave it be. They pick it up, at this interval, they review it, they stamp the new policy, and then they kind of move on to their next target item. And so it just might not happen for you this year. You might need to be built to last, to stay in that fight, to keep coming back. And again, I don't think I've not found people that are sort of evil in this. No one thinks that people shouldn't have access to evidence-based, scalable digital treatments. Everyone gets the idea, and they're sort of this seems like a good thing for our membership or our society or our healthcare system. It's then how do we actually push that through the complexities of, U.S. healthcare is that. Those are hard problems. They're not trivial.
Yeah, they are not trivial, for sure. Okay, thank you, Arun. Let me switch gears a little bit here. I wanna talk about still mental health, but now from a different perspective. I wanna discuss the mental health challenges of leadership, and starting a company, being a CEO, being a company leader, comes with significant mental and emotional pressure. We have all been there, and I'm sure that everyone watching and listening this episode can relate to this. So the question for you is, from your perspective, what are some of the most common mental health challenges that founders, CEOs, and leaders face? And how do these pressures manifest in their personal and professional lives?
Yeah, that's a big question. So, I mean, I would say first off, mental health conditions are quite prevalent, and so it just stands to reason that most founders, a lot of the founders in any given portfolio, might have one of these conditions, and they're again very treatable and manageable. And it could be depression, could be anxiety, could be insomnia. I mean, frankly, suicidal ideation, I think, is a topic that people are talking about in whispers, but the data is showing is far more common than we've realized historically. And so I think all these things are happening around all of us, our loved ones, our husbands, wives, our kids, our grandparents, our parents, our coworkers, like they're just high prevalence conditions. And so I think our eyes have been opened over the last 10 or so years to just how often this is actually going on when we open up our minds and our hearts to actually see it in those around us. I think founders and CEOs and executives have the kind of double whammy of all the pressure of carrying a business and all the shareholders and the employees and the customers, coupled with that. So that just exacerbates, I think, everything. I've spent a lot of time, and I've changed a lot in myself around how do you succeed in the role as a CEO. And I think a lot of people think of that as, particularly in the founders and it's just kind of doing a ton of stuff. Like they're working 60, 78 hours a week. They're on with customers. They're just doing a ton of stuff. If you look at the actual schedules and you spend time with these folks, and I think as I've kind of had my successes and failures and, plenty of failures and bumped into lots of issues and got lots of feedback and had the executive coaches, and I've had a bunch of issues with my kids have had a bunch of issues, and that's kind of taken me through a lot of, learning in life. And I've kind of come to a bit of a broader perspective that if we're not healthy and balanced, we're not able to lead our organizations particularly well. And that's ultimately the success factor on if you're going to have a good run as a CEO or not. It's not if you've got 70 hours a week of customer calls done. It's, did you deliver growth for the company? Did you deliver the profitability? Did you deliver amazing product? Like, again, over a longer period of time, whether or not your organization succeeds or not is going to be dependent on your ability to be clear in your thinking, to be caring as a leader, to be decisive. And like, oftentimes those things are done most poorly when you're doing the 70 hours of just like running around, like nonstop and doing stuff. So I've kind of changed, and I do a bunch of boards, and, we both share obviously doing YPO, and I talk a lot to my executives about, building programs around this stuff. Like, let's x-ray your day. Let me ride along with you for a day. I'm just going to watch and observe. Let's talk about your sleep. Let's talk about your nutrition. I mean, there was the corporate performance athlete kind of stuff out of, I think it was out of Bain or HBR a while ago that had gotten kind of popular. But, you look at how these professional athletes are managing their days and their seasons and their diet and nutrition and sleep. And you think about executives, and we couldn't be more the opposite. We just throw more and more at them. We expect superhuman levels of productivity, emotional resilience, awareness and leadership and EQ. And it's like, we're all humans at the end of the day, and we're just not going to succeed in that sort of setup. So, I feel for the burden of leaders, and I think there's a lot that can be done with a supportive coach, board members, if you have a good chairman or chairwoman, good co-founders, the executive team can share a lot of that burden. I've learned to be a lot more vulnerable and open. I think like a lot of CEOs feel like they need to have all the answers, and that projects a lot of responsibility and burnout onto them. And the simple act of sharing, hey, I'm unsure about how we should do XYZ. Like, I don't feel like we're succeeding in this arena of our business. What do you think? I used to not feel like I was allowed to say something like that. And I found that the more I've been more vulnerable, open, and transparent, it's not only shared the burden in a way that makes it a lot more tolerable for me to live my life with all that responsibility, but it's also invited a lot more ownership and participation from, the leaders that are around me, which inevitably gets way better stuff out of all of our people. So I don't know, we could spend a lot of time talking about like my learnings and success and failure as a CEO and board member around people, but it's a very hard thing. And I got a lot of empathy, for the people out there on the field that are playing that game and fighting that fight every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me try to get some specifics from you. So let's imagine for a second that you decide to start a new company, or you join a company as CEO. Like, what would you do differently this time if you were to become a CEO again? To make sure that the mental health and the physical health balance. What are some of the things that what are the right ingredients that you would put in place?
Founding's sometimes a little different because you literally got no resources and like no team, and you're just like, you're your co-founder and your dog, and you're like got a laptop and you're like, let's build a company. So that's like, there's a healthy amount of like doing in that version, but pretty quickly with some level of success, you get to even a couple employees, 3, 5, 10 employees. And I think it's a pretty different game. And maybe I'll talk more about that, certainly all the way up to hundreds, thousands of employees, which is, healthy sleep, not surprisingly. I'm reasonably, religious about getting workouts and health in. I spend time with my wife every week. We did weekly date night, and we've got to spend the time together. I spend time with each of my kids. Notice I haven't talked at all about the business and all this. Like, I find that doing that set of things allows me to be far more clear thinking and decisive and available to my people, whether that's my direct reports on a leadership team or the broader organization. And then obviously, like, all the usual stuff of, you really need to be very clear, and most, I think, founders and executives are muddy about this. You really need to be remarkably clear about 3 years from now, like, what is this thing and what is it not? And what are we today? And give me the rough, draw up the mountain from here to there. And that is an exercise in sometimes being alone, meditating, going for walks, having long ranging conversations with one of your direct reports. That's not like a structured one-on-one. It's like let's go for a walk in the park and just like talk about, like, what are you hearing from the customer? Or like, I heard this little tidbit of thing and I'm like kind of trying to understand that. And it really like set off something for me. And like, what do you think? These sort of like more broader ranging things versus like, hey, the KPI is like 100.4 and it needs to be 100.8. And like, what are we doing about that? And you need to do some of that, of course, but like the decisiveness around what are we going to be 3 years from now? What are we not going to be? And then the decisiveness on your people. I mean, you really need to have great people around you. And I found that I've had the most success probably in my career growing people, like starting with people that are relatively younger in their career and frankly have no real reason to do the thing that you're putting them in the role to do, at least on paper, but they've got great intrinsics, and giving them different opportunities and moving them around. And I have a couple of different companies I'm involved in, some of them move people between companies, and allowing them to really grow, and then, seeing them blossom in their careers. So getting the right people in place is critical. And usually, especially if you come in as someone that is hired in to run a company, just the reality is the board, somebody wants to make a change if they've sort of called you and gone through the process to make a CEO change, meaning the business isn't 100% on track in its current form. And so you probably need to change some of the people and maybe a lot of the people, and like figuring that out quickly and getting the right people into the right roles with the right accountability is crucial.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So related to that, the other question that I want to ask you, it's about learning and learning under pressure. As a CEO, when you're running a company, sometimes you're especially when you're building a company, you might not know everything about the industry. You might not know everything about your customers. You might not know everything about whatever. But, how do you approach learning as a CEO? And what key advice would you give leaders who aspire to achieve success? What are some of the key learnings on how to learn, if you will?
Yeah, listen, I've read all the books. I've gone through all the trainings. I've done all kinds of stuff. Like, I'm a big learner. So and that's out there, and we could compare notes on like the best of the books and trainings and whatnot. And like, you got a lot of them behind you on the bookshelf there. And like, we sort of know what that is. I think the biggest thing that a lot of people don't do that is rather obvious but falls away is asking open-ended 5-word-ish questions. And I want to ask my customers, I want to ask my employees, top to bottom, I want to ask my direct reports, I want to ask my board members, what's the most interesting thing that happened for you this week, at work, right? What do you think I need to know that I don't know? Tell me what you really feel about us as a customer, as if no one else was in the room, and then just stop talking and just start listening, And I think when CEOs or executives come into rooms, they feel this self-imposed requirement to have all these answers and to be clear about here's exactly what we're supposed to be doing, X, Y, Z. And I think the biggest way I found, because you want to be constantly learning. I want to every single day, I want to measure my day in increments and say, hey, in the morning today, what did I learn? And if I'm not learning on reasonably small increments, I'm failing. And I need to start thinking about myself in that way. So it's not like, I go away for a week and I read all these books in the cabin and then I come back and I've done my learning quotient for the year or quarter or whatever it may be. I want it in every day. I want it in almost every interval. So I think it's gotten a little bit harder in the COVID era, to be honest. I used to love, and I still do, but it just happens. It's love flying out to see a customer and saying, hey, can I take you out to dinner the night before? We'll have the meeting and we'll go through all the KPIs and everything, but can I take you out to dinner and what's going on for you? What's going on in the company? What are the pressures that are coming down? What are the, what are you trying to do in your career? How are you finding my team? How are you finding our work? Where are we succeeding? Where are we falling down? I feel with employees too, when you get on a Zoom thing, particularly when you do these skip levels and you're, 2, 3, 5 levels, apart sometimes from individuals, they come into the meeting and they sort of, ask you questions and expect you to go on a monologue for the 20 minutes of the meeting and answer all these questions that they have in their mind versus, flipping those. And I found that in person, that was a lot more natural and easy. Have the all hands meeting and then everyone hangs around for happy hour or whatever. And I would just ask people, show me, what have you been working on this week? Why are you excited about that? You shipped this thing in our product. How did that, what did it take to do that? Who'd you have to get involved with? That seems relatively simple, but it sounds like it was hard for you. Why was that hard for you? What was it? You could ask all these questions a little bit more naturally that in the Zoom world, it's just it's harder. You got to try a lot harder, I think, as a leader.
It's harder. It's definitely harder, but yeah, I think the common denominator of what you just shared, it's curiosity. I think you have to be curious and ask a lot of questions and just try to learn and absorb as much as you can.
I think I used to think, Rodrigo, that so much of company running was kind of top down. It was your job as a CEO to know what are the 3 things we're doing and be very clear and also, and that's largely true. But now I think about it much more as if I look at any company I'm involved in, outside in, I can understand that there's essentially a portfolio of initiatives going on. It could be there's some obviously product initiative or some sales initiative, or there's some micro initiative inside of sales to go after some new segment of customers or to do lead gen in a different way. There's sort of all these, initiatives going on in a company, could be hundreds easily once you start looking at it that way. And a lot of what I'm now trying to do is say, what can we learn from all those initiatives, right? How do we have a portfolio of initiatives that is sufficiently ambitious and extraordinary? How can we really clearly identify when we've done something that's extraordinary in one of those 100 or so initiatives? How can we draw tremendous focus to that and compound against that such that the next 100 initiatives we do look more and more like that one that was, or those couple that were extraordinary? It could be an initiative out of HR, we're trying to change something about our compensation program or our HR business partnering program or whatever. There's all these initiatives happening in any company. And I think rather than just thinking about them as the rote work that produces some corporate scorecard, I think if you kind of flip that on its head and say, what here is happening that's truly extraordinary? How do we charge some of that up to be truly extraordinary? That's my experience of how these companies then start compounding with that learning at its core, where you're getting more and more of that extraordinary. The best companies I found, I've been a part of Palantir. I was a part of Palantir for many years, amazing company. it just got better and better. Like every year we were just better. Like the company was just better. We were better at delivering great software. We were better at dealing great value for customers. We were better at going to market. Like the company just got better for 20 years. Like it's a remarkable success story that someone needs to kind of spend some time with the founders and fully x-ray. But all the best companies that I've been a part of had that either competitiveness or that desire to learn, where it was like, all right, your mile time was X. It's going to be X minus 5 seconds this next quarter. And it's going to be X minus 4 seconds the quarter after that. And just people have that, that drive, I think, to continue to elevate.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I have one more question before we wrap up, and I would love to get your perspective on the broader healthcare landscape. And the question is like, what do you see as the biggest business opportunities in healthcare today? Beyond mental health, are the well-known trends in the industry aligned with the opportunities you're most excited about?
Oh, I'm very, again, I have a long time scale by which I would answer that question. Certainly a 5+ year, if not decades. I'm very long on the healthcare innovation cycle that's going to occur, in our lifetimes. And that's because people will say, oh, but healthcare costs too much, and we need to reduce the spending and this and that. And like, we are getting remarkably better at understanding the human body and being able to deliver targeted interventions, therapeutics and otherwise, that are significantly elongating life. Whether or not we all like eat the healthy stuff we're supposed to eat, or like, sure, like, and there's a human behavior element to all this, but gosh, are we getting better? And that's like in the time scale of humanity, each of the last 10 years, we've made like exponential jumps. So I think there's going to be tremendous innovation opportunities around new therapeutics, obviously around AI in the healthcare system, around how we organize, around value-based care models, around new treatment options, new treatment models, consumer cash pay, insurance reimbursed type therapeutic models. I'm not talking about mental, I'm talking about just broadly. So I think we are in a category of the economy that is maybe like, the internet was in the 90s or something, where like, you're like, there's just a lot of stuff that's going to get created in this innovation cycle. We're not in like the tail end of an innovation cycle where it's now about divvying up the spoils or sort of competing away, the margins of each other. So I'm very long. That's I will profess that's probably a multi-decade perspective. So can I tell you next year what's really going to hit? I don't know. I got some hunches, but I don't really know. But I think it's a great time to be entrepreneuring in this space. I think the market is broadly growing, so you have a big tailwind behind you. It's hard. I've been in markets where markets are shrinking, and it is remarkably different and hard. I mean, the healthcare market is growing. There's a desire for innovation. There's a lot of value creation and economic and entrepreneurial value, I think, to be created, or for certainly the medium term, if not long term, in the sector.
And what's your opinion on raising venture capital for building health innovation companies? Is it a must have or a nice to have? Especially if it's a long term play.
It's a really good question. I mean, I'm concerned about the state of the venture capital industry, candidly, with all the capital that got raised. A lot of things that got funded aren't getting follow-on funding, and or like maybe never should have been a venture capital business, but they got funded. And in healthcare, a lot of these companies end up becoming services companies because there's clear kind of reimbursement and payment mechanisms. But services companies are much better operated typically off of their cash flows that come from delivering the service, and or like they go to private equity, or they kind of get rolled up into bigger things, and eventually they might go public. But they don't like, I think venture capital probably should be a smaller asset class and reserved for risk taking. Like the case needs to have that gets through the investment committee, needs to have a healthy amount of in 6 out of 10 versions of the future, this thing doesn't work, right? Like it's risk capital. It has to have a long-term perspective, and it probably needs to be smaller. So I think a lot of healthcare companies are not very well served to be on that. I'm raising a venture round every 12, 18, 24 months, and they're better served to exist off of, particularly the services class of companies, off of cash flows. That's hard, obviously, for entrepreneurs because you don't have much resource to get going, and you kind of have to be incredibly disciplined. But I think it gives you a lot more options over your business, and it will give you, better chances of succeeding and getting to some sort of exit in the end.
Yeah. I agree. Absolutely agree. Arun, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your wisdom. Appreciate you. And everyone who is watching and listening, also thank you. And until the next time.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Appreciate you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.